Hi, I'm Erik Hall. I'm the digital sports editor at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and I'm joined by former APSE president Vince Doria, who was president of the organization in 1983-84. He was also at the Boston Globe for 15 years. He started as assistant sports editor there and then ascended to sports editor, and he was at ESPN for 23 years as senior VP of news. Thank you for joining me, Vince.
Happy to be here, Eric.
So tell me, how did you get involved with APSE?
Well, APSE began, the originators, Dave Smith, who was sports editor at the Boston Globe, Wayne Fuson, Indianapolis, Joe McGuff, Eddie Storen, number of others, had the idea for APSE along 1972, 73. It was a bit of an offshoot. There was an organization called APME, Associated Press Managing Editors. So Dave and the others got the idea. It was generally prompted by the fact that they were not always happy with the Associated Press services. Of course, everybody had their own individual needs and wants. There was a feeling that the wire service wasn't always responsive to those. So the notion was that let's form an organization of sports editors from around the country. It would clearly give them more clout with AP. And aside from the AP relationship, it would be an opportunity to exchange ideas, to see what other people were doing in their sections, essentially to make them better. And my involvement, I came to the Boston Globe in 1975. I worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I went to the Globe in 1975 as Dave Smith's assistant. And that basically exposed me to APSE in the years of 76 and 77. And I went to the conventions with Dave, got to know a lot of people, networked, exchanged ideas, saw their sections. It was something I think that as the years went on at both the Globe and the National Sports Daily, I saw that other sections didn't have things like that. The business department didn't have something like that. The living department, metro sections, and so forth didn't have these close relationships between editors of a section, the ability to meet once or twice a year in person, to see what each other was doing, to exchange ideas, to address common problems to all of the sections. And so I got very involved in it through Dave, and Dave eventually left in 1978 to go to the Washington Star. I became sports editor of the Globe, and that probably ratcheted up my activity in APSE. So that's kind of the background.
How did you ascend into becoming president of APSE?
Just lucky, I guess. I was active in the organization, chaired some committees and stuff, became friends with people, and a lot of people became president. Obviously, it was a one-year term for everybody. Essentially, I think I served as vice president 1 year, ran for election, was elected president, and I don't know. I guess you'd have to ask the people who chose me that question, but yeah, I served my year, and we had a lot of fun. And in that year, I think what I'm proudest of, we started to discuss in 1983 and 84 the issues of access. And one of the things that was going on in sports departments at that time, historically, sports departments had been heavily, if not exclusively, white males. And there was a real understanding there in the late 70s and early 80s that they needed to diversify, racial diversity, gender diversity. And as more and more young women came into the profession, Leslie Visser at the Globe was our first female hire full time, became a national presence. The issues of access into locker rooms became a big issue. Teams resisted it, players resisted it. Sometimes players' wives were getting involved, resisting it. Typically, a lot of women who were covering sports teams in those days were not allowed into the locker room. They waited outside the locker room. Team PR people would bring players and coaches outside the locker room to talk to them, but it was not an ideal situation, obviously. And we all realized that. So during my presidency, we began discussing that, and in a larger context, the relationship with the professional leagues, who we felt needed to get behind these issues of access. So we formed a committee, which I then chaired following my presidency under Jay Searcy, followed me as president. And out of that grew a committee that drafted what we believed were the ideal rules and so forth for access to locker rooms, sent them to the leagues and pushed heavily for the leagues to get behind them. The leagues primarily did. Essentially what happened is the bigger events that the leagues oversaw, things like the Super Bowl, the NFL playoffs, World Series, and so forth, access became much better where the leagues could really impose their will. It was still a bit of a battle on the local team level, but eventually, we got what we wanted out of it. And what came out of that committee was an annual meeting every year between a group of sports editors representing APSE and the various league commissioners. We'd go to New York, and over a 2-day period, we'd meet individually with each one. And I think, that gave APSE a real presence with the leagues. And I think the leagues in large respect, I think, wanted something like that because they were able to recognize APSE as a voice representing virtually all the sports sections in the country. And, they could listen to APSE, make policy based on the input they were getting and so forth. And those meetings continue to this day. That started, virtually 35 years ago almost. And each, they've expanded it. They meet with the NCAA, they meet with, I think the PGA commissioner and so forth and so on. I think it's a good thing for APSE and sports departments as a group that they've got this kind of presence with the leagues, and the leagues still continue to recognize them as the voice of sports sections around the country.
What do you remember about those first commissioner meetings and what was kind of the setup of those?
Well, I remember Bart Giamatti bumming cigarettes off of Roy Hewitt, who was a sports editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer at the time. Not a good thing for Bart eventually, as it turned out. But, what I remember was what seemed to be a general receptivity on their part. And they listened to us. Pete Rozelle was particularly attentive, I thought. I mean, he was a guy with a PR background. He understood the values of newspapers, and I think he valued the input. David Stern was a big supporter. I got to be good friends with him. In fact, when the National Sports Daily folded, Grand Experiment in New York for a year and a half, and we were all, at least for the moment, out of work. The first guy that called me was David Stern to see if I was okay, if there was anything he could do, and so forth. So, I guess what I remember is, we made some relationships there, certainly professional and to some extent personal. And it allowed us to get to know them as more than just a face. And they got to know the people who ran these sports sections that cover them. So, that's what I remember most.
You were talking a little bit earlier about your work to improve access. Do you remember who some of the other sports editors were that worked with you to help make that progress?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Dave Smith was very involved. Buddy Martin, Van McKenzie, George Solomon at the Washington Post, Dick Sandler at Newsday, Bill Dwyer, eventually at the LA Times. I mean, I don't remember specifically who was on that committee, but all of these people, we all had the same problem. And, so there was, whatever anybody could do to help it, lend their voice to it, sign a letter, be part of a committee, lobby with their own particular individual teams in their cities and so forth. I mean, it was widespread. This wasn't something that, some people wanted and some people didn't. I think everybody realized that if we were going to do this, if we were going to diversify our sports departments, everybody in that department needed to be treated as a first-class citizen, and that wasn't happening at the time. So, it was a popular advocacy of the group. There was no real controversy involved in it.
Yeah. What are some memories of the convention from when you were president, or for if maybe not the exact year you were president, around when you were president?
Well, late night poker games. There's a big poker game going on every night. Buddy Martin was a big player. Van McKenzie, I played a little bit, and so forth. But that was one of the primary, you know, uh, diversionments when we weren't dealing with business and so
Yeah.
forth. So, I mean, the friendships you form there, these were people that you might have had otherwise. You may have had a telephone relationship with occasionally, working in the same profession, but you got to know these people face to face. They became lifelong friends. And again, I don't think other areas of a typical newspaper had that. And I remember you learned things. You saw people's sections, contest winners sections were displayed at the convention. People saw what other people were doing, you know, came up with an idea of their own, or simply stole a great idea and made it work for their newspaper and so forth. And I think it contributed to raising the standards. Ethics were a big issue then, as you probably read and so forth. In fact, at the first APSE meeting in New York, the issue of ethics was raised, and it was a controversial issue. In fact, I think Ike Gellis, who was sports editor of the New York Post at the time, actually walked out of the meeting, and the Post, never after that was particularly active in APSE. And what was going on at the time, historically, newspapers kind of accepted a lot of freebies from teams. They frequently flew on team planes, team charters. They stayed at the team hotels. The teams footed the bills for that. Uh, at the games, there was a press room that generally had an open bar and meals. In Boston, at the Fenway Park, had one of the great press rooms on the circuit there. They served a steak dinner every night. Retired baseball writers who lived in Boston and had BBWA cards, lifetime members of the Baseball Writers Association. That got them into games and got them into press boxes. Some of those guys would come every night to games, and that's where they'd have dinner, for free. And, a growing group of younger sports editors recognized that this was a real conflict, and it wasn't the way to do business. And they basically adopted a code of ethics that was later actually a written code of ethics that Hal Bodley was very involved in, that papers adopted. And it was controversial at the time, and hard to police. I mean, writers would be at games and so forth. Were they taking free drinks? Were they taking free meals? Newspapers instituted different policies. At the Boston Globe, we essentially wrote a check to the Red Sox at the end of each season to essentially cover meals and drinks that were being provided for the press there. We flew on our own commercial flights at that point, paid for our own hotel rooms, and so forth. And over time, that's how it became, throughout the industry. But, the history of that was, not a particularly good one. And papers, even when they realized that this was not the way to operate, from strictly an expenses point of view, papers had gotten used to that. And they wanted to cover these teams. They wanted to travel with them and so forth, but it had become an accepted policy that teams would pay for this stuff. So when that changed, it obviously meant a greater expenditure for newspapers. For some papers, it probably meant that they weren't going to cover teams on the road as frequently as they had. So, it was a big change in the culture.
Yeah. Um, you've talked about it a little bit, but I want to ask you maybe more directly. How has APSE impacted you professionally, would you say?
Well, look, aside from all the relationships, which are, legion, I mean, the standards that I learned through APSE, the ethical standards, the ways to approach journalism and so forth. I'd like to believe I brought a lot of that with me to ESPN when I went to television, which was, going through some of the infancy that newspaper sports departments had. And I hope that I brought things about how you operate, how you conduct journalism, the ethics you aspire to. I hope I ingrained some of that into the culture at ESPN. And in 2009, APSE gave me the Red Smith Award, and at that point, I had been out of newspapers for almost 18 years, in 1991. And to be honest, I didn't know that I was really eligible for the Red Smith Award, having worked in television for 18 years. But in talking to some of the people in the organization when I received that award, a number of them suggested that what they had in their mind, what they had seen happen was that my going to ESPN had brought a lot of the newspaper culture, to the network, and that was a good thing. So I don't know if that's true or not. I never really gave it much thought in that context, but if people saw it that way, and that was a reason for giving me that award, then I'm grateful for it.
Since you brought it up, what are some memories from receiving the Red Smith Award for you?
Well, it was in Pittsburgh, and what I remember, it wasn't the APSE convention had some great turnout numbers through the years. We've gotten up over 200 people, but in 1909, which was coming off the 2008 recession and so forth, newspapers were saving money. It wasn't as well attended. There were probably 100 or so people there, and it was in Pittsburgh, which was very close to where I grew up. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, which is about 60 miles west of Cleveland. Dave Smith came up for it. He was, retired at that time, but I worked for him for a long time. He had been active in APSE. George Solomon came. Some of my old friends like that came. I remember that. My son Matt and my daughter Abby both came to it. They were able to sit up at the head table there during the awards dinner, and it was gratifying to have them there to hear people talk about their father other than me, and to kind of get exposed to what I had done in my career and so forth. And we actually one afternoon afterwards, my wife Suzanne and I, the kids, drove over to Youngstown, Ohio, where I grew up, and it was the first time they had seen that town and where I grew up, the schools I attended, and so forth and so on. So, it was just a great 3 or 4 days, and an ability to reconnect with a lot of old friends at APSE that I hadn't seen regularly as much since I'd been at ESPN. So, I think back on that time, and it was really a great experience.
How does it feel to be one of the few people to be president of APSE and then also receive the Red Smith Award?
Well, it's not something I think about every day. But when there are moments like these where you think back on it, it's just I'm grateful. I'm grateful to have had the opportunities I had, the opportunities at ESPN, which I was able to start 3 different networks there and so forth. I feel like I was very lucky to be in sports journalism and newspapers in what really was kind of a golden age, the 70s and 80s, where newspapers were powerful voices in their town. At the Globe, particularly where I was, the spending was almost limitless in terms of where we could go and what we could do. The paper hierarchy appreciated the value of the sports section. We won a lot of APSE awards, obviously, and so forth. And I feel grateful that I was, when I see, things are different now. Obviously, it's a struggle in many cases. Papers, journalists aren't able to do as much as they want to do because the resources aren't there. I'm grateful that I was able to work in a time where, I had those resources and we could, follow through on the initiatives that we thought were important. And even at ESPN, even more so, there was a time there in the early 2000s, in the 2010 or so, when, the network was growing. We were launching new networks. It was a a time of growing influence by the television networks and so forth. And while I hope that what I did was of value in both of those places, I also understand that I was able to work in a time that was receptive to those kind of initiatives and that was willing to devote the resources to it and so forth. And that isn't always the case. It wasn't necessarily the case before then. It's clearly not the case now, I think. And I realized that I just landed in a good time. I had nothing to do with that. I hope I gave my best to it and took advantage of the opportunities I had, but those opportunities were not necessarily of my making.
Yeah. What advice would you give to future APSE presidents?
Well, it's tough, I think, because the industry is evolving and changing. I mean, newspapers are essentially digital now. The contest, I think, has turned into a digital contest and so forth. What's it going to be in 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I don't know. Maybe we'll just talk a sports section and you'll hear it in your head and that'll be it or something. I don't know. But I would say that some of the bedrock issues, the ethics that we advocated for, the standards of journalism, the way to go about it, the issues of fairness and thoroughness, so forth, those don't necessarily change, I don't think. And, if I had any advice, I would say look at some of those, bedrock issues that the organization was built on, see how they apply to your situation now. I think they'll still apply, maybe in different ways. But I think those issues will always be of value to anybody who's heading up an organization like APSE. I hope APSE is still here 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and so forth. It's had a good life. There's a history, as you've probably seen on the APSE website, that the late great Herb Stutz wrote in, I think, probably 98 or 99, 25th anniversary. Now we're heading up to the 5th. What you're doing here is sort of the next version of that, really, the video digital version of it. So, I hope it's gratifying to see that APSE still thinks about its past and its history and values that, it appears. And I hope that doesn't change. And I guess that would be part of my advice to any APSE president, to not forget about your roots, to continue to value those roots, to continue to recognize them, to value the legacies that exist and so forth. And it seems that that's happening at APSE, and I am gratified to see it.
Is there anything else you want to add, or any other stories you want to tell from your involvement with APSE?
Well, I'll tell one story, which I probably shouldn't, but he's passed away now, and well, here's what the story is. So it's a silly story. I will tell you that it has no great theme to it or any great historical impact. So I believe, 83 there, the convention was in Arizona. I think I got my year right. And Shirley Povich, the longtime columnist, originally a sports editor at the Washington Post, was being honored with the Red Smith Award. And I was out in Arizona, and I got a call from George Solomon at the Washington Post, who was coming out a day later. But he said, "Listen, Shirley's going to come the day before the convention, and I know you guys are there, and I know you'll probably play golf," which we were. So could you include Shirley? He loved to play and so forth. And I said, "Yeah, of course we can do that." And not a lot of us knew Shirley real well. We probably met him on occasion or anything. At this point, he was a columnist at the Post. He was, almost in a part-time role. He was a legend there, and he's in the office every day and so forth. And he was, and Shirley was just a classy gentleman. He was a fashion plate. I mean, he dressed well any occasion and so forth. So we get there, and we're going to meet Shirley at the golf course. And it's myself and Jay Searcy, and I, for the life of me, can't remember who the fourth member of the foursome was, who we were going to play and meet Shirley there. So we meet Shirley there, and he comes out on the veranda of the golf course, of the golf club there, and he's got he looks terrific. He's got this little straw boater on his head. He's got a beautiful lime golf shirt on, tan slacks with, sharp creases and so forth, great looking shoes. He's a picture of a golf fashion plate, except that his fly is down. And none of us had the courage to tell Shirley, okay? I mean, there was this legendary figure here that we had essentially just met, really, for the first time. We're going out on a golf course. Nobody else was going to see him or anything. And none of us had the courage to say, Shirley, your fly is down. So we went out and started playing, and somewhere along the line, and none of us saw it or whatever, something Shirley must have become aware of it and zipped up, and so forth. But we laugh about that, over the years and so forth, about how inept we were at, being able to deliver a simple message to Shirley there, who was, dressed to the nines, except for that one thing. And but he was a terrific gentleman, very worthy of the award, obviously. And it was a pleasure to play with him that day.
Is there anything else you want to add, or?
No, I think I think we've covered just about everything of note here. It's been fun reminiscing about it, and I wish you luck with these interviews.
Well, thanks so much for your time, Vince. I really appreciate it.
Okay, Eric.